Hello, everyone. So we are now in our final week of our reading of The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton and our overall study of biological psychology approach to the psychology of religion. So we have focused on, in this section, we've focused on Ramachandran with religious experience and the neurology of religious experience. Remember, temporal lobe seizures and different phenomenological aspects of the religious experience that are found in epileptic patients. Transcendence, people who have life-changing events in their life and where that seems to be processed or correlated with in the neuroanatomy. And then we turn to this fascinating look with Bruce Lipton. When I designed this course, I did so with the intention of making it not only a course that would provide you with the information, the knowledge that pertains to the discipline of the psychology of religion, but also one that would be applicable to your life. And that means that this book is a book that if you have taken the time to read it and process it and think about it, can be a revolutionary experience in your personal life. You may have things in your life that you're unsatisfied with. You may have things that you are initiating change in. Going to college might be one of those steps that you've taken to initiate change in your life. The Biology of Belief, Bruce Lipton's book, I believe, can be an asset to and an accompaniment to any endeavor that you're taking to make a change in your life. It's very easy when things don't go well for us, don't go as planned, go in a way we wanted them to go. It's very easy to point the finger to others. It's very easy to point to all the difficulties we face. However, as a therapist, and certainly taking Bruce Lipton's lead, understanding that our perception of those situations is key to getting out of the situation. So, in other words, as we're discussing here in Chapter 6, we may be in a situation that, in the vernacular, stinks, sucks, right? We might be in a bad environment. However, our perception of that environment can inherently make the situation worse, stagnant, or better. You've heard the old phrase, when given lemons, make lemonade. There's a wisdom to this that I think Lipton is expressing to us in his book. So in Chapter 6, Lipton is describing how we can have ourselves, the role we play, in activating certain issues of stress and anxiety based on our perceptions, our beliefs, and our choices within our environment. And that is what Chapter 6 is focusing on. Now, I would like you to read Chapter 6 closely, and I'd like you to do the assignment. Lipton goes through great pains to explain very clearly, very easily, and in a way that can be very applicable to your life. And concentrate on this chapter. Don't get bogged down in the cellular talk. Read it. Take it, but focus on what he has to tell you about the actual act of living and believing. So, for example, the chapter starts on page 149. Read that closely. When you get to 151, the biology of homeland defense, this is really where things start to make sense. He gets into his advice for how to make changes in our life when we get into the chapter around 152, page 152. So I want you to read the assignment first, see what I'm asking for in that assignment, and then go and read this chapter, chapter 6, closely. And it's growth and freedom. Growth and freedom. Growth and protection, rather, sorry. So in growth and protection, please do the assignment. I want to really analyze your comprehension skills this time around. I assume now you have your APA format down. And so I'm going to really concentrate on the quality of what you have to say and how you've comprehended the information. Okay, that being said, let's go to the final chapter. That's what I'm going to focus on in my lecture, and see how you do processing chapter 6, the gist of chapter 6. So we're looking at conscious parenting, and I want to start out with a few big quotes from this chapter. Lipton says, I used to think that my daughters are different because they inherited different sets of genes from the moment of conception, a random selection process in which their mother and I had no part. After all, I thought, they grew up in the same environment, nurture, so the reason for their differences had to be genetic, nature. Now, what he is expressing here is a very 19th century, so that's 1800s, view of the human condition. This old, we now call it an outdated idea of nature versus nurture. In scientific philosophy terms, in philosophy of science, we talk about not so much nature and nurture, but we talk about biological determinism versus environmental determinism. So biological determinism would be the idea that my brain chemicals, my genes, my neural firing determines who I am. That's biological determinism. Environmental determinism seems like the opposite. It is, I am a product of my upbringing, of how my parents raised me, my environmental situation. So these are the two extremes that were in the origins of academic psychology. 1800s, 1900s, it started to fall apart. Today, we have a lot of researchers and professors who teach that this is an outdated, outmoded way of thinking, and then go on to just teach it over and over again and still seem to believe in it. Biological researchers seem to have favor in biological determinism. After all, it's a safe place. Whose fault is it if it's your genes? You can't blame parents, you can't blame your environment. Environmental psychologists, so this would be people like social psychologists, are looking at social factors of income, of healthcare, of education, all of these things. The thing that I want to help you to focus on here is that these are two forms of determinism. Both are claiming that there's some kind of outside force that's determining your life. And again, this can be a very easy, Lipton would refer to it as, and I'll refer to it as a trap. It can be a very easy trap to fall into. Well, I can't do this because I don't have the innate talent. I can't take up an instrument because I don't have the talent to do so. Any musician will tell you that taking up an instrument has much more to do with your personal determination to learn the instrument than it does with any innate talent. Of course, not everybody is taking up an instrument to go to Carnegie Hall. So we go through a series of excuses often in our lives of why we don't pursue things. And that probably has more to do with a fear of failure than anything else, and vulnerability. We're going to be looking at that upcoming in our chapter on psychodynamic psychology. But to say I'm genetically predetermined for this characteristic, or its parental upbringing, or socioeconomic class, income, all these things. These are two forms of determinism, and they're very popular. Lipton's presenting us through this book with a third option, which is free will, which is choice. What do we do with the environment we grew up in, with how our parents raised us? What do we do with our genetic predispositions? How do we handle those factors in decision making? And that's what this chapter, that's what this whole book is about, but that's what this chapter really focuses on. And specifically, this chapter is presenting the idea of epigenetics. I've included a couple videos for you to watch. One is an introduction to epigenetics, and the other is Bruce Lipton's presentation himself of a lecture on this entire book. So please watch both of those videos and soak it up. And I'll do my best to present this material here about epigenetics. Basically, epigenetics is the Lamarckian view that we have genetic influence, but that genetic influence is not set in a cause and effect relationship with our experience. Rather, the environment affects the genetics affects the environment, and our choice in how we come to view that environment, or the attitude and beliefs we take about our genes, will in fact express itself in our characteristics and in our biology. So the genes might not physically change, but we change. The reorganization, that's what the epigenetic expression is. To quote Dr. Thomas Verney, a pioneer in the field of prenatal and perinatal psychiatry, findings in the peer-reviewed literature over the course of decades establish beyond any doubt that parents have overwhelming influence on the mental and physical attributes of the children they raise. That influence, so we're talking about the environmental influence on the genetics, not the environmental influence on the individual. Do you see, this is how this relationship we're looking at is the environmental determinism affecting the genetic determinism, the biological determinism, and then how that's expressed through choice, how we look at things. Lipton goes on. That influence starts, says Verney, not after children are born, but before children are born. So he's talking about learning in the womb. In a book called The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, the scientific evidence was preliminary and the experts were skeptical. But now we have many publications showing the influence of prenatal learning within the first 9 months in the womb. This is, Terry Brazelton is a very big researcher on this. Maybe some of you are parents who have read Brazelton's books, Touch Points. Fascinating books. I use them when I teach developmental psychology. And he's a psychoanalytic pediatrician. And he's done many experiments and much research into how the mother's environment affects her biology, and that biology of the mother, the hormonal levels, the stress levels, all of these things become the world of the prenatal being, the fetus, the zygote, the embryo, and the fetus. So in other words, if you're a mom and you're living under certain circumstances that are full of stress and anxiety, you're creating a cortisol, a hormonal level within your body that the fetus is adapting to, preparing for your world. There's been much research to show that mothers who intentionally meditate, change their perception of their individual, lower their anxiety, lower their stress, has dramatically different effects on the characteristics of the fetus, the development of the fetus. That's what this stuff is talking about here in The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. He goes on to point out that Freud discussed infantile amnesia, and that's the idea that we do not consciously remember things from 9 months. Typically not before the age of 2 or 3 3 or 4 do we ever begin to remember an autobiographical memory. This is what Freud referred to as infantile amnesia. And the reason this is being brought up by Lipton is that he's pointing out that just because we don't remember something or don't have it fit into our symbolic order of who we are autobiographically in a narrative form, so because we don't have that doesn't mean it hasn't influenced us, that the effects aren't there in another form from early childhood. He goes on to say the fetal and infant nervous system has a vast sensory learning capabilities. and a kind of memory that neuroscientists call implicit memory. That's also, neuroscientists call it, biological psychologists call it implicit memory, psychoanalysts call it the unconscious. It's the same thing. David Chamberlain writes in his book, The Mind of Your Newborn Baby, the truth is much of what we have traditionally believed about babies is false. They are not simple beings, but complex and ageless, small creatures with unexpectedly large thoughts. Now again, this isn't the kind of thinking that we have learned through language, through grammar, past, present, future, cause and effect. This is a different type of processing. Here's a famous experiment in developmental psychology. If you take a pen light, a little flashlight, or a bell, and you put it near the mom's womb with the fetus in, and you ring that bell or put the light against the womb, and you're taking a scan of the fetus. For the first time, the fetus will look over towards the light or will look towards the bell when it rings. For a second ringing or shining, the fetus will look. By the third time, a neurologically healthful fetus will stop looking. It habituates to the stimulus, just like us. When something flashes up, the first time it catches our attention. The second time it might catch our attention. By the third time, we don't have to look at it. We already know it's there. It's actually a sign of neurological impairment, of brain damage, of a problem in development if the fetus keeps looking at the light. So this is how neurologists and pediatric psychiatrists actually research and determine if there's neurological damage in the fetus while in the womb. This is learning in the womb, learning that, oh, there's a bell. They're not saying there's a bell, but looking towards a stimulus and looking away from a stimulus after repetition. Okay, so that's just to give you an illustration. The quality of life in the womb, our temporary home before we were born, programs our susceptibility to coronary artery disease, to stroke, to diabetes, to obesity, and a multitude of other conditions in later life, writes Dr. Peter W. Nathaniels, in Life of the Womb, Origin of Health and Disease. I'm not sure how to pronounce Nathaniels, but that looks close to me. So his book, The Origin of Health and Disease. So he also writes, there is mounting evidence that programming of lifetime health by conditions in the womb is equally, if not more important than our genes in determining how we perform mentally and physically during life. Gene myopia. Now, myopia or myopia, when one's myopic, it means they're narrow-minded. They're nearsightedness. That's myopia. And when we talk about this intellectually, if someone tells you you're myopic, it's not a compliment. It means that you are unable to see bigger pictures, that you're caught up, you're seeing trees and not the forest. And this is something that is not a very wise intellectual approach to be taking. Big picture thinking is always a good idea. You can zoom in and look at things in detail, but you always have to keep that zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, big picture. So gene myopia is the term that best describes the current all-pervasive view that our health and destiny throughout life are controlled by our genes alone. So this is almost like becoming obsessed about genetics and how the genetics determine us. He goes on to say, in contrast to the relative fatalism of gene myopia, that's determinism, in other words, you have no choice in the matter, understanding the mechanisms that underlie programming by the quality of life in the womb, we can improve the start of life for our children and their children. So in other words, in the womb, the conditions that the mother is in the environment affects the hormonal levels, the physical environment for the fetus. The mother can change her interaction with that environment, which will change her internal environment, which will have different effects on the fetus, development of the fetus. The idea that parents can transmit hereditary changes from their life to their children's is, of course, a Lamarckian concept that conflicts with Darwin. So remember, we studied Lamarck earlier in this section, in this book. The transgenerational passage of characteristics by non-genetic means does occur. Lamarck was right. although transgenerational transmission of acquired characteristics occurs by mechanisms that were unknown to this day. And this is where epigenetics comes in. The responsiveness of individuals to the environmental conditions perceived by their mothers before birth allows them to optimize their genetic and physiologic development as they adapt to the environmental forecast. The same life-changing epigenetic plasticity of human development can go awry and lead to an array of chronic diseases in older age if an individual experiences adverse nutritional environmental circumstances during fetal and neonatal periods of development. So what we're discussing here is in the parental programming, the power of the subconscious mind, we're seeing is that we have influences that are not directly genetic influences, but have influenced our biology from the choices of our parents, but primarily the mother during gestation. And this is the idea of epigenetics, the expression of characteristics due to environmental and biological factors interacting rather than just one genetic determinism. So if we go to the, I'm going to scroll down to just the end here. It goes into great detail, visualizing the information processing powers of the conscious and subconscious minds. Consider the image of Machu Picchu. Above is comprised 20 million pixel dots, each representing a bit of information received by the nervous system. The powerful subconscious mind processes all this information in 1 second. How much of that is incoming information enters into the conscious mind? In the lower picture, the dot represents the total amount of information that is processed by the conscious mind. So study after study has shown in memory study and consciousness studies that what comes in is much greater than what we're consciously aware of perceptually. So I'm going to scroll down to the concluding chapters, the concluding part of this chapter, and show you where he ends up with this. He concludes, evolution has created an important role for parents and guardians, and now that I'm a grandfather several times over, this is Lipton speaking, not myself, I have to add grandparents, loving adults who play a fundamental role in shaping the future of the children they raise and their children's children's future as well. Each of us must stop to consider how negative programming impacts children's futures, for we are helping to shape the fate of human civilization. Progress is all too slow for those of us who have focused on parents' role as genetic engineers for so long, but whether it's 30 million words initiative that teaches parents how to improve their children's language skills, or JAMA arguing that non-statin approach to improving children's health, or medical professionals advocating a reduction in the use of microbiota depleting antibiotics, it's an advancement towards the day when every human adult has the big picture in mind, no matter who raises a child, and that child's behavior will influence the evolution of us all. So we wanted to just end this discussion of Lipton with his own final words. What he's telling us is, as a biologist, as cellular biologist, we have to take into consideration that we have biological influences. Those biological influences are dynamically influenced by environmental factors, environmental determinism. But the influence is going horizontally. Biology, environment influencing each other. It comes to be expressed in the conscious self, a perception of the environment, a perception of the biological limitations and gifts that we may individually have. To put it in a nice little wrapped up bow, ultimately, what you come into the world with biologically and the conditions under which you grow up in, and you live in your environment are largely expressed as a consequence of your beliefs about your genetics and your beliefs about your environment. So this is a powerful book. I hope it's a book that I've read now 4 times. I hope that you've gotten something personally out of this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what that is. At least in one aspect, you may have more in your assignment. So enjoy learning about yourself and taking these things into consideration.